The first light of a Pacific dawn rose in thin, amber bands as a lone P-38 Lightning carved its way across the quiet sky. Its twin booms glimmered against the water below, the engines humming with a confidence that outpaced the reputation of the pilot inside. On the radio nets scattered across the Solomon Islands, operators tracked the aircraft with mild curiosity. The call sign was unfamiliar, the voice steady, almost soft. Few knew the young man guiding the Lightning home. Fewer still imagined what he would become. Far to the west, a Japanese reconnaissance crew glimpsed the strange silhouette. The P-38's shape remained unusual to them, long-legged, angular, deceptively swift. They recorded it as an aggressive twin-boom fighter, a new American presence they had not expected to see so early. Not here, not yet. To them, it was simply another machine. They had no sense that the pilot who flew it would soon tilt the arithmetic of the Pacific War in ways they had not planned for. Along the rough American airstrips below, ground crews exchanged quiet remarks about the same unknown flyer. The stories felt improbable. A polite young man from Wisconsin, barely settled into the rhythms of combat flying, returning from sorties with victory claims that sounded too neat, too sudden. Most dismissed it as enthusiasm spoken through dust and exhaustion. The Pacific had already consumed veterans. It offered no reason to believe a newcomer could carve his name into its storms. Yet when the narrative pauses, when the camera-like gaze settles on Richard Bong's face, one sees none of the bravado that usually accompanies such rumors. His expression remained calm, almost boyish. He flew not with swagger, but with an unstudied precision that seemed to come from somewhere far quieter than ambition. It was 1942, and American air power in the Pacific stretched thin across distances that defeated maps. Squadrons lacked seasoned pilots, commanders lacked time. In the shadows of early losses, the theater hungered for someone who could shift momentum even slightly. Bong's answer came abruptly. On his first genuine encounter with the enemy, he downed 2 aircraft before the sky had time to tighten around him. But the greater question lingered. How could one quiet Midwestern pilot bend an entire theater of air combat? The next chapter would begin to reveal the cost of that answer. In the first months of the Pacific Air War, the skies belonged to no one. Maps showed neat lines of influence, but the air above them told a different story. One of scattered squadrons, improvised tactics, and pilots learning in days what peacetime manuals had never prepared them for. It was a theater born in chaos, where doctrine arrived too late, and survival depended on instinct rather than training. Every sortie felt like an experiment, every encounter a reminder that the war above the islands had not yet found its shape. Japanese aviators held the early advantage. Many were veterans of China and Southeast Asia, men hardened long before America understood the scale of what was coming. Their weapon, the Mitsubishi A6M-0, moved through the sky with a confidence that bordered on inevitability. It climbed faster, turned tighter, and seemed able to appear out of the sun at will. Against it, American aircraft suffered heavily. Pilots learned quickly that courage alone could not compensate for performance gaps. They flew not to dominate, but to endure long enough to fight again. Then came the P-38 Lightning, long-legged, heavy, and unlike anything else in the Pacific. Its twin engines gave it reach, its firepower gave it presence, and its speed carried a promise that the Allies did not yet know how to use. It waited like a tool without a craftsman, for someone who could coax purpose from its unconventional frame. Richard Bong watched the war unfold through quiet study. He observed senior pilots fall in combat, men he admired, men he wished he could have learned from longer. Each loss carved new patterns into his understanding of enemy tactics. Where others saw chaos, he traced repetition, angles of attack, climbing habits, the small hesitations that even elite opponents revealed under pressure. Soon, Japanese units began noticing an American fighter that did not behave like the others. A long-nosed twin boom, they reported, appearing at ranges where no U.S. aircraft should have been, attacking and vanishing before they could respond. The first true shock came when Bong landed from one of these distant hunts, stepping out of a P-38 riddled with bullet holes through both wings, and 2 more victories written quietly into his log. What no one realized yet was how quickly those patterns he studied would start bending the entire battle in his direction. In the operations rooms of Rabaul, the early reports arrived with a tone of irritation rather than alarm. Japanese officers studied reconnaissance logs describing a twin-tailed demon harassing patrol routes. The phrasing sounded theatrical, almost careless, yet it appeared again in separate accounts from different crews. Something was disrupting routine flights, striking quickly, retreating before counterattacks could form, and vanishing into cloud decks as if guided by instinct rather than orders. No single name was attached to these encounters, only the shape, a long-nosed twin-boom silhouette, cutting in at angles the Zero could not easily block. Misidentifications spread quickly, as they often did in an air war where seconds felt like minutes. Some crews swore they had seen 2 aircraft flying so tightly together they seemed fused into one. Others insisted the Americans had introduced an entirely new model, a machine faster than reports suggested, and somehow always positioned exactly where Japanese formations felt most vulnerable. A few officers dismissed the sightings outright, chalking them up to coincidence, fleeting engagements misremembered in the turbulence of combat. But coincidence, repeated often enough, becomes something difficult to ignore. Across the Pacific, American commanders finally turned their attention to the growing stack of victory claims, filed under one modest signature, Lieutenant Richard I Bong. At first, they approached the numbers with caution. Confirmation standards were strict, and early war chaos made verification slow. Bong's manner added little clarity. He spoke of his victories with a neutrality that unsettled senior officers. There was no embellishment, no pride, no urgency. He cared only that the mission had been completed and that he could fly again the next morning. It was within that quiet demeanor that the P-38's full potential found its shape. In Bong's hands, the Lightning lost its reputation as an oversized curiosity and became a precision weapon. He understood its strengths: speed in the climb, stability in a dive, concentrated firepower, and used them with an analytical calm that contrasted sharply with the intensity of the air war around him. The aircraft did not define him. He defined what the aircraft could become. By late 1942, Japanese pilots began requesting additional escorts when operating in the sector, marked by Bong's squadron. They did not know his name, but they recognized the pattern. Patrols disrupted, formations broken, confident veterans forced into evasive climbs they had once dictated to others. One pilot should not have mattered. Soon, he would matter more than anyone expected. Richard Bong's calm in the cockpit did not begin in the Pacific. It began on a dairy farm in northern Wisconsin, where the rhythm of each day depended on patience, repetition, and the quiet discipline of hands that understood the value of small, consistent actions. The landscape around him, flat fields, slow rivers, long winters, taught a kind of stillness that later translated into the air. He grew up in a world where nothing was rushed and everything mattered, where machinery was treated with respect, and weather could be read in subtle shifts of wind and light. Those habits carried into his flying long before he ever met an enemy aircraft. His early lessons in civilian flight schools revealed something his instructors struggled to articulate. Bong possessed an intuitive sense of spatial awareness, a natural ability to understand how an aircraft held energy through the sky. He learned quickly where lift hid at the edge of a stall, how small corrections could reshape a climb, how a turn tightened when weight was managed rather than forced. Instructors marked him as talented, but even they underestimated how deeply he absorbed every sensation of flight. For Bong, flying was not an adrenaline pursuit. It was a language that made sense without translation. In the Pacific, his composure stood out almost immediately. Comrades noticed that the young pilot who spoke softly on the ground grew even quieter in the air. Turbulence, enemy bursts, sudden shifts in formation, none of it seemed to disturb him. When others tightened their grip, Bong relaxed his. He flew with a steadiness that created a margin where fear could not intrude. To many, it felt uncanny. To him, it was simply the only way he knew how to work. Between sorties, while others sought rest, Bong occupied himself with studying Japanese tactics. He read debriefs, examined gun camera footage, and memorized the behavior of Zero pilots during climbs, breakaways, and diving escapes. He noticed patterns others overlooked, a tendency to roll left under pressure, an instinct to circle into the sun for concealment, a preference for luring Americans into turning contests they could never win. These were small observations, but they accumulated into a quiet mastery that shaped every decision he made. American command initially failed to see the value of this modest intensity. They placed their hopes in senior officers and established aces, assuming experience alone would stabilize the theater. Bong, young and unassuming, did not fit the image of the pilot who would shift momentum. He offered no bravado, no declarations of skill, but he believed something many veterans forgot in the desperation of early war. Survival came from precision, not courage. Each movement had to be deliberate. Each engagement had to be controlled. Recklessness was not heroism, it was waste. On the other side of the fight, Japanese aviators maintained their early war assumption that American pilots lacked discipline and technical sophistication. They believed the Zero's agility, paired with their combat experience, would continue to decide engagements on their terms. It was an arrogance born from early victories, and for a time it seemed justified. But arrogance thrives best before it is challenged, and its cost becomes clear only when a quiet farm boy begins rewriting the rules of survival. In the next chapter, those assumptions would meet their first true test. In the early years of the Pacific War, the Mitsubishi A6M-0 held a presence that went beyond its technical performance. It became a legend, an aircraft whispered about in briefing tents and referenced in battle reports with a mixture of respect and unease. Pilots spoke of its turning radius as if it were a law of nature, not a product of engineering. Its dominance shaped strategy on both sides. The Japanese leaned on its agility, and the Americans learned to expect that any turning fight would end in loss. The myth was not merely about the aircraft, it was about inevitability. Engineers who studied the Zero understood the paradox that made it so formidable. It excelled at low-speed maneuvering because it sacrificed what other fighters considered essential: armor, self-sealing tanks, structural reinforcement. The result was a lightweight machine that could twist through the sky with remarkable precision. But this design carried its own trap. At high speeds or steep dives, the aircraft stiffened, its controls growing unresponsive. The strength that made it terrifying in a slow duel became a weakness when matched against an opponent who refused to fight on its terms. Richard Bong recognized this early, long before his superiors understood the full, tactical implications. He listened to the stories surrounding the Zero, but refused to absorb their fatalistic tone. In the P-38, he saw a machine capable of outrunning the myth, not by matching the enemy's maneuvering skill, but by exploiting the spaces where the Zero faltered. Bong built his tactics around energy, keeping altitude, managing speed, and turning every engagement into a vertical contest the Zero could not follow. Where others hesitated, he attacked with calculated reserve, striking from above and disappearing before the enemy could reorient. Quietly, he began teaching these principles to other pilots. He urged them to dive rather than circle, to climb rather than tighten their turns, to maintain the initiative rather than surrender it to the Zero's strengths. His instructions represented a subtle shift in doctrine, one not yet formalized by command, but passed from pilot to pilot in the spaces between missions. It was not revolutionary in volume, but in effect. Japanese commanders entered this period with confidence born from earlier campaigns. They believed their experience in China and the Pacific would continue to dictate air battles, that American pilots would remain predictable, hesitant, and reactive. Their assumptions rested on the belief that the Zero's supremacy would hold as long as pilots used it as intended. But Bong's victories began to chip away at that certainty. Encounter reports from Japanese units included hesitations, references to P-38s that climbed beyond reach, attacked in brief, punishing bursts, and refused to be drawn into maneuvering traps. Veteran pilots who once dictated the terms of combat found themselves on the defensive, forced to adjust to an opponent who did not play by familiar rules. The first cracks in the Zero's myth appeared quietly. Some Japanese aviators began avoiding engagements with P-38s when possible, choosing discretion over the risk of meeting a pilot who understood where their legend ended, and soon those cracks would widen into something impossible to ignore. The mission began like dozens before it, routine, predictable, the kind of escort operation that lulled even seasoned pilots into a cautious rhythm. The morning sky over the Pacific lay still, a pale sheet stretching toward distant weather fronts. Richard Bong lifted his P-38 into that quiet air without anticipation of anything extraordinary. His task was simple: protect the bombers, return home, prepare for the next day's work. But the Pacific seldom honored routine, and within minutes the calm horizon fractured into movement. Japanese aircraft rose from scattered bases like sparks thrown from a fire. What should have been a measured exchange became a swirling melee, a sky where altitude lines blurred and engines screamed through the humid air. Bong saw the first group break toward the bombers and reacted with the steadiness that defined him. He brought the Lightning into a dive, feeling its weight turn into speed, its twin engines tightening the arc exactly as he intended. He struck once, cleanly, and climbed before the wreckage touched the sea. The second engagement came almost immediately. A Zero tried to force a turning contest, falling into the comfortable routine that had trapped so many American pilots before. Bong refused the invitation. He used the P-38's vertical power, climbing out of the reach of the tightening spiral and rolling back down with deliberate precision. The Zero stalled, trying to follow. It never recovered. In less than a minute, 2 enemy aircraft were gone. What followed had the density of a single moment stretched across an entire sky. More fighters converged, each assuming they could overwhelm this lone American before he regained position. But Bong met them with the same studied calm he carried into every sortie. He shifted altitude with a surgeon's restraint, using the P-38's stability in dives and its speed in climbs to control the rhythm of the fight. The Japanese pilots, expecting familiar patterns, found instead an opponent who refused to give them the angles they had mastered. One by one, the aircraft fell. A third, 0, struck during a climbing turn. A fourth, caught as it broke left into the sun. A fifth, downed in the final minutes of the encounter, leaving Bong momentarily alone in a sky that had been crowded with danger moments before. When he returned to base, the P-38 bore the heat-scored marks of the fight, but his voice on the radio remained as calm as it had been at takeoff. Word spread through American installations with a speed normally reserved for disaster. 5 confirmed victories in a single mission, an achievement so rare that many initially dismissed it as miscommunication. But eyewitness reports aligned. Gun camera footage corroborated the sequence. There was no exaggeration. Bong had done the impossible, and suddenly, the name that had circulated quietly among pilots became a headline across the theater. Across the water, Japanese units reacted with disbelief. Some officers assumed the reports were inflated, the product of American optimism rather than fact. Others believed the kills had been shared among multiple pilots. The idea that one farm boy in a twin-engined fighter had unraveled a full formation in minutes seemed implausible. American leadership, however, read the reports with a different understanding. They recognized not simply a gifted pilot, but a tactician, someone who saw the structure within chaos and used it to reshape the terms of combat. In a war desperate for momentum, Bong represented something rare, and through it all, he remained uneasy under the weight of attention. The spotlight felt undeserved, the acclaim distracting. For Bong, the victories were not a legend. They were a responsibility. And that responsibility was about to pull him deeper into a conflict he had never sought to define. With each victory, Richard Bong found himself carrying a responsibility he had never asked for. Success in the Pacific did not bring celebration, it brought expectation. Commanders who once viewed him as a talented newcomer now saw him as a stabilizing force, someone who could anchor entire sectors simply by being present in the sky. When bomber crews scanned their escort rosters and saw his name, the tension in the briefing rooms eased. When they did not, the silence thickened. Bong understood what that meant, and the knowledge settled heavily on his shoulders. His assignments shifted accordingly. Instead of seeking individual engagements, he now flew escort missions for the long-legged bombers pushing deep into enemy territory. These missions demanded something different: endurance, discipline, and an unwavering focus on protecting aircraft far more vulnerable than his own. The bombers moved at speeds that felt glacial compared to the P-38, locking escorts into long, predictable routes that invited attack. Bong flew these patterns again and again, studying the ocean below, the clouds above, and the unseen geography where ambushes waited. He knew that the bombers depended on those thin lines of defense, and he recognized how fragile those lines truly were. Japanese air groups responded to his rising legend with their own adjustments. They reorganized squadrons, assigning experienced pilots specifically to confront the American they called the twin-tailed hunter. The battles began to take on an uncomfortable focus. Enemy fighters sought him out, testing his reactions, probing his confidence. Some approached with caution, others with determination, all believing that eliminating Bong would tilt the balance back toward their favor. The air war became more personal, even if no words were exchanged across the sky. The shifting pressure found its first cracks when Bong began losing comrades in well-executed ambushes. These were not the chaotic skirmishes of earlier months, but deliberate strikes, coordinated with precision and aimed at disrupting American formations. Bong watched pilots he respected fall in seconds, aircraft spiraling into cloud and sea before he could intervene. For the first time, doubt edged into his quiet confidence. He questioned whether he had misread the enemy, whether the tactics that once protected him now exposed others to greater risk? These questions did not fill the debriefing rooms. They lived silently in the long walks back to his quarters. Fatigue deepened as the pace of operations accelerated. The toll was not physical alone, though the long sorties and irregular sleep exacted their price. It was moral. Each confirmed victory arrived with diminishing relief. The exhilaration felt early in the war faded, replaced by a solemn acknowledgement of consequence. Bong began to understand that success in the Pacific was measured less by triumph than by the absence of loss, and that every name missing from roll call was a debt carried forward. Victories that once felt clarifying now left him more aware of the growing ledger of sacrifice. His diary entries from this period reveal a quieter dimension of the war, one mostly hidden from the public narrative forming around him. He wrote about the fear of failing at precisely the moment others depended on him most. He questioned whether a legend could ever serve the truth, or whether it created an impossible shadow he was expected to fill. These reflections were restrained, written in the same modest tone he carried into daily conversations, but they exposed a weight he rarely spoke about openly. Yet even under this strain, Bong found a way to give shape to the pressure. He turned his attention toward the younger pilots arriving in theater, men who had the courage but not yet the understanding to survive against experienced Japanese opponents. He taught them what the Zero could and could not do. He explained the value of altitude, the danger of accepting a turn, the need for discipline when instinct urged risk. These lessons were not delivered with authority, but with humility, as if he were passing along the knowledge that had once protected him in moments of chaos. In doing so, he began to redefine what leadership meant in the Pacific. The legend others projected onto him mattered far less than the responsibility he felt toward the pilots, learning to fight beside him. And as new threats gathered on the horizon, those lessons would matter more than he could yet imagine. As the Pacific War deepened, the American air campaign entered a phase that blended engineering with survival. The P-38 Lightning, once an unfamiliar silhouette in the sky, began drawing the attention not only of pilots, but of the designers who had shaped it. Engineers from Lockheed and the Army Air Forces studied frontline reports with growing urgency, searching for the small refinements that could shift the balance of the air war. They listened to every detail from the men who flew the fighter at its limits: engine temperatures and humidity, the strain of high-altitude climbs, the visibility challenges in crowded skies. Out of this slow, iterative exchange, a new way of fighting began to form. Richard Bong provided some of the most valuable feedback, though he never considered it exceptional. His notes were spare, almost clinical: how the P-38 behaved when pushed through steep dives, how its twin Allison engines responded under rapid throttle changes, how the cockpit frames shaped low-sun visibility at critical moments. He observed the moments when the Lightning felt light and eager, and the moments when it resisted, stiffening under high speed, just as the Zero did, but at thresholds he learned to anticipate. His reports lacked embellishment, which made them all the more useful. Engineers began to trust his descriptions, knowing he offered neither praise nor complaint, only truth. From these insights emerged the early outlines of an informal doctrine. Pilots had long understood the basics of boom and zoom combat, but Bong's precision gave the method a disciplined structure. American flyers learned not just to dive, but when to dive, not just to climb, but how to retain the altitude that made their aircraft unassailable. The P-38's strengths, speed, firepower, and vertical maneuvering became pillars of a coordinated approach rather than isolated advantages. What had begun as improvisation in scattered dogfights transformed into a set of shared tactics, reinforced during briefings and practiced in the skies over new island bases. Japanese pilots, accustomed to dictating the shape of combat, began noticing the change. American formations no longer entered engagements as scattered individuals, but as coordinated units designed to neutralize the Zero's turning superiority. Flights operated in layered altitudes, one element diving while another guarded the climb. The familiar lure of the turning fight found fewer takers. Zero pilots who once controlled the tempo now found themselves chasing fleeting opportunities, forced to rely on evasive climbs that exposed their aircraft's structural limits. What had once been a sky shaped in their image was beginning to shift out of their control. During this period, Bong expanded his role beyond combat. He became an increasingly present figure among younger aviators, men newly arrived from stateside training who understood the mechanics of flight but lacked the instinctive caution of experience. Bong guided them through the subtleties of the Pacific, humidity that strained engines, cloud banks that hid entire squadrons, enemy tactics that relied on disciplined restraint rather than recklessness. He taught them to trust altitude, to know when to commit and when to disengage, to see combat not as a contest of nerve, but as a sequence of calculations. These lessons, delivered quietly and without emphasis, shaped a generation of pilots who carried his discipline into every mission. Yet as his influence grew, so too did a different kind of pressure. Bong found himself navigating not only the complexities of war, but the weight of his own rising status. He sensed the unease in the way others spoke to him, respectful, careful, as though addressing a figure larger than the man he knew himself to be. Commanders consulted him for tactical input, pilots watched him for cues, newspapers back home began to follow his ascent with an enthusiasm that felt disconnected from the reality of the front. Bong had never sought leadership, yet it gathered around him all the same, demanding a steadiness he sometimes doubted he possessed. Still, the innovations shaped during this period proved decisive. American squadrons, once scattered and reactive, grew into coordinated, lethal units. Their tactics were no longer improvised but engineered, refined through feedback, shared rigorously, and executed with a discipline that matched the intensity of the conflict. The P-38 evolved from a misunderstood experiment into a cornerstone of strategy, its pilots flying with the calm certainty that they finally understood both their own strengths and their enemy's limits. And as this transformation reached its peak, the stage quietly set itself for the next shift, one where strategy, technology, and pressure would converge in ways neither side fully expected. By 1943, the air war over the Pacific had evolved into a contest shaped not by numbers, but by the few pilots capable of defining its rhythm. Among them were the elite Japanese flyers, veterans forged in years of combat across China and Southeast Asia, men whose reputations preceded them into every engagement. And rising to meet them was Richard Bong, the quiet American whose name had begun to surface in whispered conversations across intelligence rooms on both sides. The next phase of the conflict would not be a single battle, but a series of encounters unfolding over weeks, each one sharpening the skills of those who survived. The first of these engagements began innocuously, with Bang's P-38 escorting bombers toward a cluster of enemy installations. The sky appeared calm, yet at altitude a formation of Japanese fighters shadowed the bombers' path, probing for weakness. When they descended, they did so with the precision of men accustomed to deciding the terms of combat. Bong resisted the instinct to respond immediately. Instead, he climbed, widening the distance, forcing the attackers to choose between pressing their advantage or rising into an engagement they could no longer control. It was a small decision, almost invisible in the scale of battle, but it marked the tactical patience that set him apart. In the days that followed, the pattern repeated. Japanese pilots adjusted their tactics, attacking from steeper angles, attempting to break the escorts before they could climb. Bong studied these shifts with the same calm he applied to every aspect of flying. He mapped enemy approaches, reading their timing, their hesitation, the fractions of seconds when their formations loosened. Each encounter refined his understanding. Each escape, each strike, each near miss narrowed the margin between survival and mastery. The more the Japanese learned, the more disciplined Bong became. His patience soon emerged as his most decisive weapon. Where others rushed toward the fight, he waited. He denied the enemy the turning duels they sought, refused to spiral into low-altitude traps, and resisted the pressure to finish engagements quickly. This restraint frustrated opponents who relied on aggression and instinct. Bong fought not to prove skill, but to maintain advantage, holding altitude above all else, preserving speed for the exact moment when the enemy's confidence edged into mistake. The climactic confrontation came on a clear morning when his squadron encountered a larger Japanese force than intelligence had predicted. Several veterans flew among them, airmen who recognized Bong's tactics and had come prepared with a coordinated plan. Their ambush unfolded with practiced efficiency. One group baited him with a shallow turning climb, while two more attacked from opposite sides, converging in a pincer designed to trap him at mid-altitude, far from the sanctuary of high sky. For a moment, the geometry favored them. Bong felt the trap tightening, the P-38's controls responding sluggishly as he pushed it through the dense, humid air. Rather than commit to a panicked escape, he reduced his climb just enough to mislead his pursuers. The Japanese pilots, anticipating a full retreat, overshot their angles. Bong seized the brief imbalance, diving steeply before they could correct. The P-38 gathered speed like a weight falling through water, its twin engines stabilizing the plunge. He rolled out low, then began a disciplined climb, using the Lightning's vertical power to regain lost ground. When the Japanese attempted to reform, they found his P-38 not in retreat, but repositioned high above them. In a series of controlled bursts, he struck at their formation, each attack brief, precise, and devastating. The ambush unraveled. Veteran pilots who had expected to dictate the encounter suddenly found themselves reacting to a man who read their formation as clearly as the instruments in his cockpit. By the time the duel ended, the sky had quieted into an uneasy stillness. The ocean below held the drifting scars of battle, while Bong circled above, ensuring his surviving comrades returned to formation. His radio remained calm, his tone unchanged, yet the significance of the engagement reached both sides. Japanese command concluded that this pilot's success could no longer be dismissed as luck or favorable circumstances. He was methodical, disciplined, and dangerously adaptive, attributes rare enough individually, extraordinary when combined. In the aftermath of these battles, Bong's tally rose to 28 confirmed victories. The number marked more than achievement. It reflected a shifting balance in the Pacific. The war around him was changing, new aircraft, new tactics, new pressures gathering beyond the horizon, and soon that transformation would demand choices no legend could evade. By 1944, the Pacific War had entered a phase of accelerating momentum. Island by island, the American advance pushed westward, tightening the ring around Japan's defensive perimeter. Airfields once considered remote now served as forward bases, launching daily operations that tested aircraft, pilots, and command structures to their limits. At the center of these movements stood Richard Bong, no longer an emerging talent, but a combat presence whose name carried weight in planning rooms across the theater. His role expanded with the offensive, each new operation drawing him deeper into a conflict that demanded precision at every turn. Japanese air units confronted a different reality. The veterans who had once shaped their dominance were dwindling, lost to attrition, illness, or the relentless grind of multi-front warfare. New pilots arrived in increasing numbers, but their training, once rigorous and exhaustive, had compressed under the pressure of urgency. The result was a growing gap between experience and expectation. American commanders noticed the shift in enemy behavior, formations less cohesive, attacks more hesitant, reflexes sharpened by fear rather than instinct. Bong saw it most clearly from the cockpit, where each encounter revealed a shrinking reservoir of seasoned opponents. With this change came a new caution, threading itself through Bong's flying in ways he had not anticipated. It was not fear, but awareness, a recognition that the war had entered a stage where a single mistake, a single overlooked detail, could nullify years of survival. The P-38 had become familiar to him, almost an extension of his own sense of balance. Yet he flew with the understanding that even mastery had limits. He checked his instruments more often, studied the horizon with increased vigilance, and declined risks he might have considered acceptable months earlier. Experience had not dulled his confidence, it had refined it. Major ground invasions demanded extensive air cover, and Bong's presence became integral to these operations. He flew escort for bombers, striking strategic positions, intercepted attackers, targeting fragile supply lines, and patrolled skies above amphibious landings where even a single enemy aircraft could disrupt the delicate choreography below. During these critical battles, his tally continued to rise, not through dramatic duels, but through a steady accumulation of engagements where discipline mattered more than brilliance. He downed aircraft that threatened his formation, aircraft attempting to break through bomber screens, aircraft flown by men who no longer represented the elite cadre America had once feared. His combat reports from this period held a tone noticeably different from those written earlier in the war. The precision remained, the times, the altitudes, the angles, but between the lines emerged a deepening introspection. He wrote not of triumph, but of necessity, noting the ease with which he could outmaneuver opponents who lacked the experience to recognize danger before it closed around them. A quiet sadness threaded his observations, as if he understood that each victory carried a human cost, increasingly weighted by imbalance. The war was no longer a contest of equals. It was becoming a procession of mismatches. Japanese pilots felt this imbalance acutely. Younger recruits, trained in compressed programs with fewer hours in the cockpit, struggled against American flyers who had survived years of hard lessons. For them, encountering Bong meant facing a level of tactical composure rarely matched within their own ranks. They fought with courage, often with extraordinary resolve, but resolve alone could not bridge the widening gulf between experience and opportunity. Many entered combat knowing the odds, yet flew regardless, driven by duty rather than expectation. Amid these shifting dynamics, a turning point emerged with quiet gravity. Bong's tally approached the all-time American record, 26 victories held by Eddie Rickenbacker since World War I. It was a milestone few had imagined achievable at the war's outset, especially in a theater where survival often outweighed ambition. Yet Bong reached it not through pursuit of glory, but through endurance, discipline, and a steadfast devotion to the mission. His rising count became a symbol for some, a point of pride for others, and a burden he struggled to reconcile internally. As he drew nearer to the record, the air war transformed around him, new strategies forming, new technologies arriving, and new expectations shaping every decision he made. and what waited beyond that record would test him in ways no tally could measure. The mission that would carry Richard Bong to his 40th, confirmed victory, began under a sky washed pale by the rising sun. It was late 1944, and the tempo of the Pacific Air War had reached a relentless cadence. Sorties rising from new island bases, bombers fanning toward enemy shipping lanes, patrols sweeping the horizon for any sign of resistance. Bong launched into that morning with the same quiet focus he brought to every flight. No one, not his commanders, not his wingmen, not even he, expected the day to mark a milestone in American aviation history. Japanese scouts sighted the formation first, small silhouettes glinting against the high glare. They observed the American aircraft from a distance they believed safe. Years of experience had taught them the limits of their opponents' machines, and they assumed the P-38s lacked the acceleration to close the gap quickly. What they misunderstood, what Bong had long ago mastered, was how the Lightning transformed in a dive, gathering energy with a speed that startled even those who trusted it most. The scouts misjudged by seconds, and in air combat, seconds were enough. Bong tracked their movement from altitude, reading their shallow banking pattern, the loosened spacing that suggested confidence rather than caution. He waited. The P-38 held its height like a poised blade, engines humming with restrained potential. When he finally rolled into the dive, the world seemed to tilt beneath him. Air resistance thickened around the cockpit, the altimeter spun downward, and the Lightning surged forward with a predatory momentum the scouts had never accounted for. By the time they recognized the danger, the distance between them had collapsed into a span too narrow to escape. The engagement that followed was swift, almost surgical. Bong fired only when angles aligned perfectly. No wasted bursts, no sweeping corrections, only the disciplined timing that defined his craft. His tracers struck the first scout before it could peel away, the aircraft disintegrating into a streak of smoke that trailed downward toward the open sea. The second attempted a desperate climb, trying to exploit the Zero's low-speed agility, but Bong anticipated the move and rose with controlled precision, cutting across its path. A short burst ended the encounter. The fight had lasted mere moments, a quiet punctuation in a sky that quickly returned to calm. On the ground, controllers monitored the engagement through fractured radio calls and brief flashes of static, then silence, long enough to draw glances across the operations room, long enough for someone to question whether the P-38s had slipped beyond reach. When the radio finally crackled, the voice that emerged was steady, almost understated. Bong reported the kills with the same tone he used for routine traffic, as if announcing altitude rather than achievement. The room exhaled, though no one said the number aloud. Superstition lingered in every corner of the war. When confirmation reached the bases, celebration spread with a rare intensity. Pilots cheered, ground crews exchanged weary smiles, and commanders allowed themselves a moment of relief in a campaign that seldom offered reasons to pause. 40 victories, an American record not just exceeded, but redefined. Bong had become the highest-scoring U.S. ace of the war, surpassing every pilot who had flown before him. His name would now stand as a measure of skill, endurance, and the strange mixture of restraint and audacity that shaped air combat in the Pacific. Yet Bong himself met the news with a subdued calm that surprised even those who knew him well. He accepted congratulations with genuine appreciation, but without celebration. To him, each victory represented a moment of necessity, not triumph. He thought about the risks taken, the aircraft lost around him, and the narrowing pool of experienced Japanese pilots whose final moments he had witnessed through a gun sight. Glory had no place in those memories. He carried the tally with a sense of responsibility rather than pride. Across the ocean, Japanese officers received the reports with disbelief. They had long known his name, though many assumed the accounts of his skill were inflated by American propaganda. But the numbers could not be ignored. No single pilot, they argued, should be capable of such dominance, not in a theater defined by shifting conditions, long missions, and the unforgiving nature of tropical air. And yet the records were clear. Their remaining veterans spoke of a man who fought with a precision they had rarely encountered, who refused to be drawn into traps, who seemed to read the sky with an instinct that turned experience into something more potent. The milestone marked a climax in Bong's combat career, a moment when personal achievement intersected with the widening arc of the war. 40 victories in the Pacific sky, earned through discipline rather than spectacle, caution rather than bravado. And as his name settled into the record books, the conflict around him continued to evolve, because even at the height of his success, the war was preparing to demand something different from him, something far beyond a number. American commanders had watched Richard Bong's ascent with equal measures of pride and apprehension. By late 1944, his reputation had grown beyond the reach of the front lines. He had become a symbol, a figure invoked in newspapers, recruitment halls, and congressional speeches. Yet symbols are fragile, and the thought of losing him, of watching the nation's top ace fall in combat just as he reached the height of his fame, created a fear no tactical briefing could soften. Command weighed the calculus of morale against the needs of the war and made a decision that Bong himself would never have chosen. They ordered him home. The reassignment came quietly, delivered not in ceremony, but in a short, plain message. He was to leave the Pacific and return to the United States to support war bond tours and public relations efforts. Officially, it was presented as recognition for extraordinary service. Unofficially, it was a protective measure. The Army Air Forces could not risk losing a man whose name had become synonymous with American air power. The war needed heroes, and heroes were too valuable to fall at the wrong moment. For Bong, the news arrived with a strange mixture of relief and disappointment. He had flown more than 200 combat missions, survived hundreds of hours in hostile airspace, and reached a tally no one believed possible at the war's outset. Yet he felt no sense of completion, no arc closing naturally. Instead, the order felt abrupt, a door shut before he had fully stepped through it. The war continued. The men he had taught continued. The skies he knew so well remained filled with demands, and he was no longer permitted to meet them. Returning home brought an unfamiliar emptiness. Bong found himself standing on stages in crowded auditoriums, speaking to civilians whose understanding of the war came from headlines and radio bulletins. They applauded the uniform, the record, the legend. He responded politely, but inside he felt the dissonance of a man who had spent years in the unforgiving clarity of combat, now asked to inhabit the softer world of speeches and handshakes. The contrast left him unsettled. He knew how to navigate danger. He did not yet know how to navigate admiration. Grounded, he watched messages from the Pacific arrive with the distant weight of a life paused. New offensives began, new pilots rose, and the rhythm of combat continued without him. He felt the pull to return, the reflexive urge to rejoin the men whose fates remained tied to the skies he had once defended. But the order stood, immovable, and he was left to confront a truth long obscured by routine. His victories had never felt like triumphs. They had felt like tasks, necessary, precise, burdensome. Without them, he confronted the void they had been filling. His reflections deepened in this stillness. The nights were quieter, the days structured around obligations that lacked the sharp urgency of combat. He wrote about responsibility more than achievement, about the pressure of being seen as something larger than he was, about the knowledge that every tally carried a life on the other side of the gun sight. In these private moments, the myth receded, revealing the human weight behind each of his decisions. As the war progressed, Japanese archival records, studied later by historians, confirmed what American commanders had long suspected. Bong's presence had influenced not just individual battles, but operational patterns. Reports detailed escort missions aborted when P-38s appeared, formations disrupted by his tactics, and pilots who chose disengagement rather than risk an encounter with the twin-tailed killer. He had become a variable in Japanese planning, an unseen force shaping the air war even when he was not present. The impact of that influence persisted well beyond his final mission. The climax of Bong's wartime story did not arrive in a dramatic final dogfight, nor in a last burst of gunfire over the Pacific. It arrived instead in the quiet decision that ensured his survival. His war ended not with a victory, but with an order, one that preserved the man even as it removed him from the sky that had defined him. It was an ending rooted in necessity rather than narrative, in the recognition that some lives carried a weight too important to risk further. And as he stepped into this new, reluctant role, the legend he had become began drifting into memory, while the war, vast and unrelenting, continued without him. When Richard Bong returned to the United States, the war seemed to dissolve briefly into a softer, almost unreal world. Train stations filled with crowds who gathered not out of fear or urgency, but pride. Children held small flags, newspapers shouted his name in bold type, and civic leaders waited beside podiums decorated with ribbons. They cheered him as a hero, but he felt curiously distant from the sound. After years of hearing only engines, radios, and the sharp percussion of gunfire, applause felt foreign, something happening around him, not to him. He smiled out of courtesy, but inside he remained detached, unsure how to inhabit the version of himself that others seemed determined to celebrate. Newspapers across the country turned his record into headlines, meant to reassure a public still weary from years of sacrifice. They counted victories the way accountants tallied sums, stripping them from context, from consequence. Bong winced at the exaggerations, the dramatized retellings, the phrasing that hinted at ease or spectacle. None of it matched the quiet discipline he knew from the cockpit, or the weight that settled after each mission. He avoided interviews when he could, stepping away from photographers with a polite nod, retreating into the modest silence that had always felt most natural. Meanwhile, letters arrived from the Pacific, thick envelopes bearing the names of pilots he had flown beside, men still living inside the unrelenting rhythm of operations. They wrote of new sorties, of bases carved out of coral and jungle, of losses that arrived without warning. Some described victories, though these were shared with the understatement of men who understood how fragile triumph could be. Others mentioned his absence directly, offering a blend of gratitude and frustration. They missed his presence in the sky, yet they understood why command had pulled him back. Each letter reminded him that the war continued without pause, and that the bond between pilots stretched across distance more easily than across changing circumstance. These letters drew Bong into a deeper reflection. War, he realized, had always balanced on a brutal symmetry, skill on one side, timing on the other, instinct meeting chance, discipline confronting uncertainty. A dozen factors combined to decide a single encounter, many beyond the control of any pilot. He understood that his survival had come from preparation, yes, but also from moments when conditions aligned in his favor, while failing others. It was a truth he could never express on a public stage. It belonged only to those who had witnessed the sky's indifference firsthand. As he followed news from the Pacific, the scale of Japan's unraveling became clear. The once formidable Japanese air arm, defined by veteran pilots, technical daring, and early war momentum, collapsed under competing pressures. Attrition eroded its core. Technology gaps widened. Strategic decisions stretched remaining pilots across too many fronts. Aircraft crews now faced opponents with superior numbers, improved equipment, and increasingly refined tactics. The decline was rapid, but it had begun earlier in places few civilians ever saw, in disrupted formations, aborted missions, and the silent recalculations of squadrons that once flew with confidence. Looking back, Bong recognized how his own early victories fit into this wider shift. Each forced withdrawal, each broken attack, each enemy pilot compelled to disengage created small fractures in the structure of Japanese air power. These fractures multiplied across campaigns, compounding into vulnerabilities Allied planners could exploit. The effect was cumulative, not personal. His precision in individual combat had contributed to openings that fleets and armies would later widen into strategic advances. He had never thought of it in those terms. Air combat felt too immediate, too intimate, but hindsight revealed connections that the chaos of war once obscured. In the quiet of his return, removed from the roar of engines and the tension of combat, Bong began to understand the consequence that lay beyond numbers. It was not the tally of victories that shaped the turning of the war, but the cumulative force of countless disciplined decisions, each one tilting the balance a fraction more toward Allied momentum. His role had been a thread in that larger tapestry, one of many, yet no less significant for its modesty. And as America pushed deeper into 1945, the shape of the conflict continued to change, drawing him toward a final chapter he never could have foreseen. When the Second World War ended, Richard Bong found himself standing at the threshold of a new frontier. The skies he had mastered in the Pacific were already giving way to a different kind of flight, faster, quieter, more unforgiving. America's aviation landscape shifted almost overnight as engineers and pilots moved from propellers to jet engines, from wartime necessity to peacetime innovation. Bong, now a national figure whose combat record seemed beyond comparison, chose not the comfort of retirement but the uncertain path of a test pilot. It was an environment where experience mattered, but where instinct mattered even more. His calm precision, honed through years of split-second decisions, proved invaluable in this new era. Jet aircraft behaved differently from anything he had flown in the Pacific. There were no piston rhythms, no familiar vibrations, no gradual sense of acceleration. Jets surged forward with a smoothness that felt at once elegant and deceptive, erasing the cues pilots had relied on for decades. Bong approached these machines not as weapons, but as problems to understand, engineering puzzles expressed in metal and airflow. His reports were meticulous, just as they had been in war: fuel behavior at altitude, engine response during rapid throttle changes, the strange silence that accompanied jet flight at high speed. The Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star became the centerpiece of his work, a sleek, swept machine that represented a leap beyond everything the war had produced. It climbed with authority, dived with ease, and carried a promise that future aircraft would break limits once considered impossible. But it also demanded caution. The P-80, like all early jets, existed at the edge of what engineers understood. It introduced dangers unfamiliar even to veteran pilots: compressor stalls that snapped thrust without warning, flameouts when airflow faltered, control issues that emerged at the very speeds jets were built to achieve. These were not flaws so much as unknowns, the growing pains of technology racing ahead of experience. Bong confronted this new era with the same quiet courage he had carried into the Pacific. He flew not for recognition, but for clarity, to understand the machine, to give engineers the data they needed, to help shape the next generation of American air power. He knew the risks. Test piloting had always carried a sharper edge than combat, because the enemy was uncertainty itself. Yet he moved through the program with a steady patience that reassured those working alongside him. They trusted his instincts, his calm under pressure, his ability to recognize danger seconds before it became fatal. On August 6, 1945, the world shifted again. As the sun rose over Japan, the first atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima, introducing humanity to a force as devastating as it was irreversible. That same morning, at a small California airfield, Richard Bong climbed into a P-80 for another test flight. The day carried no ceremony, no fanfare. It was meant to be routine, a continuation of the quiet work he had embraced since returning home. Shortly after takeoff, the flight went wrong. A mechanical failure, swift and absolute, robbed the aircraft of power. Witnesses watched as Bong fought to control the P-80, guiding it away from houses, searching for space that simply did not exist. There was no time for recovery. The jet fell, and the man who survived years of combat in the Pacific, who had outflown veteran enemies, mastered an untested aircraft, and carried the weight of a nation's hopes, was gone. News of his death reached the public only hours after the headlines from Hiroshima. Two stories, vastly different in scale, collided on the same page. One marked the beginning of a new and terrifying age. The other marked the loss of a quiet hero whose life had bridged the worlds of propeller and jet, war and peace, past and future. Bong's death became a somber counterpoint to the war's approaching end, a reminder that progress, however necessary, always carries a cost. And as America looked toward the uncertain horizon of the jet age, the man who once ruled the Pacific sky faded into memory, leaving behind a legacy written in precision, restraint, and the quiet courage that defined both his wars. In the decades after the war, Richard Bong's story shifted from headline to history, from celebration to contemplation. Historians began to reassess his legacy with the distance time allows, peeling back the layers of wartime mythology to understand the man behind the tally. What emerged was not the caricature of a natural-born killer, nor the swaggering archetype often assigned to aces, but something rarer, a pilot defined not by numbers, but by discipline, restraint, and an almost austere understanding of his craft. His record, 40 confirmed victories, became merely the doorway into a much deeper truth about how he fought and why he mattered. Declassified Japanese archives added another dimension to that truth. Reports written during the war's most intense months showed genuine astonishment. Analysts debated whether the same American pilot could possibly have been responsible for so many disrupted operations. Some believed the accounts exaggerated. Others argued that multiple pilots must have been mistaken for one, but the pattern was unmistakable. Engagements involving a twin-boom fighter consistently ended with broken formations, aborted escorts, or cautious withdrawals. Even commanders far removed from the front lines sensed a presence, an American who refused the turning fights that once favored them, who struck with discipline rather than improvisation, who denied them the initiative they had built their doctrine upon. Their surprise, recorded in stark and methodical language, revealed how deeply one man had unsettled their expectations. Among veterans on both sides, memories of Bong carried a different tone. American flyers spoke of his fairness in debriefs, never overstating claims, never taking credit for kills he could not verify. Japanese pilots who survived encounters with him described an opponent devoid of cruelty, precise in his attacks, measured in pursuit, unwilling to fire beyond necessity. In an era defined by brutality, Bong fought with a clarity that separated skill from savagery. The war demanded lethal action, but he never allowed lethality to become its own reward. That distinction, subtle yet profound, shaped the way other pilots remembered him long after the conflict ended. His tactical influence extended far beyond memory. The energy-based combat style he refined in the Pacific became a cornerstone of American fighter doctrine during the jet age. Training programs emphasized altitude control, disciplined engagement, and the avoidance of unnecessary risk, principles Bong had embodied instinctively. Instructors taught students to fight the battle on their terms, not the enemy's. Manuals echoed strategies he had practiced long before they were formally written. Without intending to, he had helped codify the transition from instinctive dogfighting to analytical air combat, where decisions mattered more than aggression and survival depended on geometry as much as courage. The P-38 Lightning, once considered unconventional, found its place in museums as more than a relic. It became a symbol of the moment when engineering and human skill intersected to change the course of a war. Visitors stood beneath its long wings and twin booms, imagining the silence before a dive, the split-second judgments that turned altitude into advantage, the calm pilot who guided it through some of the most demanding skies of the 20th century. The aircraft's shape became inseparable from Bong's story, a reminder that machines alone do nothing until someone understands what they can truly become. As the years stretched into generations, the meaning of Bong's life grew quieter but more enduring. His story stood as a counterpoint to the destructive forces that defined his century. In an age marked by firestorms, atomic blasts, and the industrial scale of warfare, he remained a symbol of humility, proof that mastery need not be loud, and that great skill can exist without ego. His achievements were vast, yet he carried them lightly. His reputation grew enormous, yet he never tried to enlarge himself. And perhaps that is why his legacy endured not as legend alone, but as a lesson. For the war he fought, for the age he inhabited, and for the sky he shaped with precision rather than spectacle, one truth remains. They believed one man could not shape a sky. Richard Bong proved them wrong,